My name is Clara, and I was 31 years old the afternoon my sister stood in my studio doorway, looked at the shelves of finished work lining every wall, and said, "You know this is never going to pay a mortgage, right?" She didn't say it cruelly. That was the part that stayed with me longest. She said it the way you tell someone their umbrella has a hole in it, practically a little impatiently, like she was doing me a favor by being honest. "You're talented, Clara, obviously. But pottery is a hobby. You need something real." Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the record speak for itself. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, new stories every week. And if something in this one lands close to home, drop it in the comments. I read everyone. I didn't argue. I wiped my hands on my work apron, nodded once, and said I'd think about it. I had been selling work for 9 years by then. I had pieces in collections in 4 states. And there was one other thing, something I hadn't told my family yet, something I'd been sitting on for almost 6 months while the paperwork was finalized, that would answer her question better than anything I could say out loud that afternoon. I just had to wait for the right room. I grew up in a house that valued credentials you could frame. My father was an orthodontist. My mother had a master's degree in education and had been a school principal for 22 years before she retired. My older sister, Diane, had followed something close to their blueprint: undergraduate degree in business, MBA at 26, a mid-level management position at a regional logistics firm that she described, always with a certain careful pride, as a growth stage company with serious regional reach. Our younger brother, Marcus, was still in college studying finance when most of this story takes place, but even he had the language down: internships, networking events, LinkedIn recommendations from professors. He spoke about his future the way people in my family spoke about most things, in terms of structures, ladders, and measurable outcomes. I was the one who didn't fit the pattern. Not because I was less capable. I want to be clear about that. I graduated in the top quarter of my high school class. I was accepted to a 4-year university and attended for 2 years before I left. Not because I failed. Because I walked into a ceramics elective in my 2nd semester and understood, with a clarity I had never felt sitting in an economics lecture or a statistics lab, that this was the thing I was supposed to be doing with my hands and my time and whatever concentration I had to give. I finished the semester, went home for the summer, told my parents I was taking a gap year, and never went back. My mother cried. My father asked me, twice, if I was sure. Diane, who was 24 at the time and already 2 years into her MBA program, sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, very carefully, "Clara, I just want you to think about what you're giving up." I thought about it. I went back to the studio I'd rented with 2 other artists in a converted industrial building on the east side of our city, Millhaven, a mid-sized lakeside city in the upper Midwest, the kind of place with a functioning arts community that nobody outside the region has heard of, and I started working. That was 9 years before the museum opening. In those 9 years, I did not become rich. I want to say that plainly because the story I'm telling you isn't about money, and I don't want you to misread it as one. I paid my rent. I paid my studio lease. In the first 3 years, I supplemented my income by teaching wheel-throwing workshops on weekends, $12 classes, 8 people at a time, mostly beginners who wanted to make something with their hands and didn't know where to start. I liked those classes. I liked watching people discover that the clay had its own opinion about what it wanted to become. By year 4, I had stopped teaching workshops because the sales had grown enough that I didn't need to. I was selling through 2 galleries in Millhaven, one in Chicago and one in Portland, Oregon, that I'd connected with through a group show I'd submitted to almost as an afterthought. The Portland gallery moved 3 pieces in the first month. They called me directly after the 3rd sale and asked if I could supply them on a recurring basis. I said yes. By year 6, I had work in 14 gallery collections across the country. I kept a spreadsheet, not because I needed to track it for any official purpose, but because I liked the discipline of it, the same way I liked the discipline of a consistent firing schedule and the ritual of mixing my own glazes from scratch rather than buying them pre-mixed. The spreadsheet had columns for the gallery name, the city, the piece title, the sale price, and a notes column where I recorded anything that seemed worth remembering. One entry from year 5 said simply, "Juror called it the most controlled surface tension in the show." Kept that one. My family knew approximately none of this. Not because I was hiding it from them. I had mentioned the Portland Gallery in passing at a family dinner. I had told my mother about the Chicago show. But the way I mentioned these things, quietly, without the vocabulary of achievement that my family recognized, without the PowerPoint-ready metrics of revenue growth and market penetration, meant that what I said went in one ear and arranged itself, automatically, in the mental folder they had already created for me, which was labeled something like Clara's hobby. Check in periodically. Don't encourage too much, or she'll never get a real job. Diane was the most consistent about this. Not malicious. I want to keep saying that because it's true and because it matters to the story. She genuinely believed she was being loving. She asked about my pottery the way you ask someone about a long-running project you expect will eventually be set aside. How's the studio? She'd say, with the particular warmth of someone who has already internally categorized the answer. Are you still doing the workshops? Even after I'd told her twice that I'd stopped doing workshops because I didn't need to anymore, she kept asking. The person in my family who came closest to understanding what I was actually doing was my grandmother on my mother's side, Nana Ruth, who was 78 years old and had been a seamstress for 40 years before her hands made it impossible to continue. Nana Ruth had never used the word hobby to describe her own work, and she didn't use it to describe mine. She came to the studio once, a few months before she passed, and walked the shelves the way you walk a museum, slowly, stopping in front of each piece, tilting her head slightly, as if she was listening to something the object was saying quietly. She stopped in front of a wide, flat bowl I'd made the previous winter. Dark brown clay, almost black after firing, with a rim that I'd worked thin enough that the light came through in certain spots, not dramatically, not in a way you'd notice from across the room, but present if you looked for it. A kind of quiet translucence in the edge. Nana Ruth put one finger along the rim, very gently, and said, "You know what you're doing." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation, the way a carpenter might say it to another carpenter. I understood what she meant. I said thank you. She nodded and moved on to the next shelf. She passed the following spring. She left me her sewing cabinet, a small, dark wood piece with 6 drawers, still full of threads she'd chosen herself, and a note in her handwriting that said, "Keep going. The quiet ones always outlast the noise." I kept the note in my studio, tacked to the wall above my work table. I looked at it every morning. The thing I hadn't told my family, the thing I mentioned in the opening, the piece of information I'd been sitting on for 6 months, had started 18 months earlier with a phone call from a woman named Dr. Aldridge, Associate Curator of Contemporary Craft at the Millhaven State Museum of Art. I had submitted work to the museum's open call 2 years prior and hadn't heard back. I'd assumed the submission had been declined and moved on. When Dr. Aldridge called, I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number. She told me the museum had been awarded a significant capital grant from the State Arts Endowment to build a new wing, the Contemporary Craft Wing, the first of its kind at a state museum in our region. The wing would be anchored by a permanent collection of work from regional artists working in ceramics, glass, fiber, and metalwork. They were inviting 12 ceramicists to contribute. They had reviewed my submission from 2 years ago and several pieces that had been flagged for them by the Portland Gallery owner, who apparently knew Dr. Aldridge personally and had mentioned my name. They wanted to include a piece of mine in the permanent collection. I stood in my studio for a long moment after she finished explaining, looking at the far wall where a row of finished pieces sat drying on wire shelving. "Permanent collection," I said. "Permanent collection," she confirmed. "We're acquiring the piece. It stays at the museum. We'd like to have it formally unveiled at the wing opening if you're willing." I said I was willing. The paperwork took 4 months. The acquisition agreement was standard, reviewed by an attorney the museum provided, and one I hired myself, a woman named Patricia Osei, who specialized in artist contracts and who told me, after reviewing everything, that the terms were clean and favorable and that I should sign. I signed. The piece, the dark bowl with the translucent rim, the one Nana Ruth had touched, was transported to the museum by a professional art handler 6 months before the opening. I didn't tell my family any of this. Not strategically. Not as a scheme. I just didn't find the moment. Or rather, I found plenty of moments, and in each one I imagined trying to explain a permanent museum acquisition to people who still called my work a hobby, and something in me quietly declined the effort. I would tell them at the opening, I decided. The opening would be the moment. I put the invitation in a drawer and waited. The opening was scheduled for a Saturday in early October, and by early September the family calendar had already stacked itself around it in ways I hadn't anticipated. Diane's company was hosting a regional industry conference the same weekend, a thing she'd been organizing for several months and was clearly proud of. She mentioned it at dinner in late August, running through the details. 240 attendees, a keynote from a logistics executive she described as nationally recognized, a Saturday evening reception at a downtown hotel. "It's going to be a big deal," she said, and I could see from the way she said it that she meant it not just as information, but as measurement. "This is what a big deal looks like," the sentence implied. "This is the scale of thing that matters." Our mother had already committed to attending the reception. Marcus had his midterm exams that weekend, but had promised to try to come in for the Saturday evening portion. My father, who was less mobile than he used to be after a knee replacement the previous year, was planning to come to the reception dinner and leave early. Nobody asked what I was doing that Saturday. I almost brought it up. At that same dinner, I had the words ready. "The museum is opening a new wing on Saturday. I have a piece in the permanent collection." I thought I mentioned it, but I hadn't quite. I'd mentioned the museum in the past. In that same vague way I mentioned everything, and it had been filed in the same folder. I could have said it plainly then. I chose not to. I picked up my fork and listened to Diane talk about the keynote speaker. A week before the opening, I called Diane to tell her. I decided I wanted her to know before she saw it, or before she heard about it from someone else. She answered on the second ring. Sounding distracted, I could hear keyboard clicks in the background. When I explained what I was calling about, there was a pause. "The museum," she said. "The State Museum. They're opening a new craft wing. They acquired one of my pieces for the permanent collection. The opening ceremony is Saturday." Another pause. Then, "Oh, Clara, that's really nice. It's great that they're doing that." She said it in the tone of someone noting that a neighborhood restaurant had won a local paper's Best Brunch award. Warmly, but with no particular adjustment of her frame. Is it like all local artists? Community type thing?" 12 ceramicists, I said. Regional artists. It's the first permanent contemporary craft wing at a state museum in the region. "That's lovely," she said. "You must be excited." "Hey, I'm so sorry. I'm literally in the middle of something for the conference. Can we talk about it next week? I want to hear more." We didn't talk about it the following week. The conference consumed her entirely, and I let it. The Saturday of the opening was cool and dry, the kind of early October morning in Millhaven that smells like wood smoke and lake water at the same time. I drove to the museum alone, arrived 45 minutes early, and stood in the new wing for a moment before anyone else arrived. The wing was beautiful. High ceilings, natural light from a bank of north-facing skylights, warm hardwood floors. 12 pieces displayed on individual plinths, each lit from above by a narrow beam that picked up the surface detail without flattening it. My bowl sat near the center of the room. Under the light, the translucent rim was visible from 6 feet away, a faint, warm glow along the edge, like something breathing. I stood in front of it for a minute. Then Dr. Aldridge arrived and came across the room to greet me, and the morning began. By the time the ceremony started, there were around 200 people in the wing and the adjoining gallery space. Museum donors, civic leaders, arts journalists, a delegation from the State Arts Endowment that had funded the wing, and a general public audience that had come because the event had been well publicized. The mayor was there, 2 state legislators, a professor from the university's fine arts department who had apparently been advising the museum on the acquisition process, and my family. I had not expected them, and then I had, and then I hadn't again. I'd told Diane the date, and she'd said she'd be at the conference. But at some point in the previous week, I'd find out the details later. Someone from the museum's public affairs office had sent a press release to local media, and a brief item about the wing opening had run in Millhaven's main newspaper. The item mentioned the 12 featured artists by name. My name was in it. Diane had seen it. She had forwarded it to the family group chat with a message that said, "Did anyone know Clara has something at the museum this Saturday?" My mother had replied, "I knew she did some things with the museum. I didn't know it was this weekend." My father had replied with a thumbs up, which was his response to most things he processed on his phone. Marcus had said, "Wait, is that a big deal?" "It sounds like a big deal." Diane had replied, "It's a community arts thing, I think." Nice for her. They came anyway. Conference logistics had worked out such that Diane had the morning free before the afternoon sessions, and she'd rounded up my parents and driven them over. Marcus had come in the night before for reasons unrelated to any of this and tagged along. I saw them across the room, about 12 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to start. They were standing near the entrance to the wing, coats still on, looking around with the slightly uncertain expressions of people who have arrived somewhere they hadn't planned to be and aren't sure of the protocol. My mother spotted me first and waved. I walked over and said hello. My father hugged me and said the building was impressive. Marcus looked around the room with the wide, slightly overwhelmed expression of someone encountering a much larger event than he'd anticipated and said, "There are a lot of people here." Diane hugged me and said, "This is really nice, Clara, I'm glad we made it," and then looked at the program she'd picked up from the table by the door. "Which piece is yours?" she asked, scanning the room. "Is it one of the big ones? Or more of a smaller thing?" "It's in the center section," I said. She looked toward the center of the room. The bowl was visible from where we stood, dark, low, quiet on its plinth. From this distance, in this light, it looked like something that had always been there. "Oh," she said, "that one." A pause. "It's pretty." I said, "Thank you." The program coordinator came by and told me they'd be starting in 8 minutes. I excused myself. The ceremony opened with remarks from the museum director, a measured and careful man named Mr. Ellison, who talked about the capital grant, the 18 months of acquisition work, and the museum's commitment to building a permanent record of regional craft practice. He said some things about the relationship between functional objects and fine art that I thought were precise and true. The audience listened. Then the State Arts Endowment representative spoke, a compact, efficient woman named Commissioner Vance, who talked about the endowment's priorities and the significance of this being the first dedicated craft wing at a state institution in the region. She said it clearly into the microphone, to the whole room. The first of its kind. First in the region. Marcus, standing about 15 feet to my left with my family, looked over at me. I could see him recalibrate something in his expression. He looked back at Commissioner Vance, then down at the program in his hand. Then Dr. Aldridge took the microphone. She was a tall woman in her early 50s with a precise way of speaking, every sentence thought through before it left her mouth. She thanked the director, the commissioner, the donors. She talked about the curatorial process, the open call, the hundreds of submissions reviewed, the deliberate effort to build a collection that represented genuine range rather than a single aesthetic tendency. She talked about the difficulty of selecting 12 pieces from a field that had included artists from across the region. And then she walked the room. She moved to the first piece, a tall, ridged vessel by an artist from the southern part of the state, and spoke for about 90 seconds about the work and the artist. She named the artist. She mentioned the artist's exhibition history, a grant they'd received, a notable collection that held their work. She did this for each piece in order, moving through the room with the quiet authority of someone completely at home in this space and this conversation. When she reached the center of the room, when she stopped in front of the dark bowl with the translucent rim, I was standing about 8 feet away, slightly to one side, where the ceremony coordinator had placed the artists, so we were visible, but not crowding the curator. Dr. Aldridge stood in front of the bowl for a moment without speaking. She tipped her head, just slightly, the way Nana Ruth had once done. Then she said, "This piece is by Clara Voss of Millhaven. Ms. Voss has been working in high-fire stoneware for just over 9 years. In that time, her work has entered 14 national collections. She has been selected for 3 juried national exhibitions. Her surface technique, and what you see here in the rim of this bowl, if you look at it in this light, this quality of translucence in a form that is otherwise dense and contained, that technique has been described by jurors as, quote, among the most controlled and original approaches to glaze chemistry working in regional ceramics today." She paused. We are very pleased to have this piece in our permanent collection. It will be here for as long as this museum stands." She moved on. The room had not stopped. People were still breathing, still standing, still holding their programs. Nothing had frozen in any cinematic sense. Life continued at its normal pace. But my family had gone still. My mother's hands, which had been loosely holding her program in front of her, had come together. Not clenched, just brought together, fingers touching, the way hands move when the mind is processing something large. My father had taken his glasses off, which he sometimes did when he was working something out. Marcus was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Not quite surprise, because surprise passes quickly, but something that settles in the features more slowly and stays longer. Something like realization. Diane was looking at the bowl. She was standing at the edge of the family group, her program lowered to her side, and she was looking at the bowl the way someone looks at a thing they have been telling themselves is small and are now quietly having to revise. Her mouth was closed. Her shoulders, usually squared the way they are when she's managing an agenda, had dropped an inch. She didn't say anything. Dr. Aldridge continued to the next piece. The ceremony went on. Commissioner Vance said a few closing words. Mr. Ellison thanked the crowd. There was applause. I walked back toward my family. My mother spoke first. She reached for my arm and said, "Clara, 14 collections." "Yes," I said. "You never told us." "I mentioned it a few times," I said, quietly, without accusation. "It didn't land." She absorbed that. Her hand stayed on my arm. My father put his glasses back on and looked at me with the careful expression he used when he was being precise. Is this work that's been recognized outside Millhaven? National organizations?" "Yes," I said. "The 14 collections are across the country. Portland, Boston, Chicago, others." He nodded slowly. He was not a man who performed emotion, but something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the specific discomfort of recalibrating a long-held assumption in real time. Marcus said, "The curator said, as long as this museum stands." "She did," I said. He exhaled. "Clara, why didn't you tell us?" "I tried," I said. "It's okay." He shook his head, not arguing, just sitting with something. Diane was last. She had moved to stand slightly in front of the bowl, looking at it directly, close enough now to see the rim in the light from above. I stood next to her. For a while she didn't say anything. I didn't prompt her. Then she said, "How long has it been doing that?" She meant the translucent rim. The light through the clay. "Since I fired it," I said. "About 2.5 years ago." "And you knew it would do that?" "I hoped it would. I'd been working toward it for about a year before I got it right." She was quiet again. "I called it a hobby," she said. "Not to me exactly, more to the bowl or to the room." A statement of fact, registered quietly. "You did," I said. "For a long time." "Yes." She didn't apologize then. I didn't expect her to. Not yet. Not in that moment in front of 200 people in a room that was still full of the weight of what had just been said aloud by someone other than me. The apology would come later that evening, in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, during which she said things I believe she meant, and which I received without any particular satisfaction, but also without any performance of graciousness. It was a real conversation between two people who had been operating on different sets of information for a long time and were now, awkwardly, getting on the same page. That was later. In the moment, standing in front of the bowl in the light, I said nothing more. I didn't need to. Dr. Aldridge had already said everything that needed saying, in a clear voice, into a microphone, in front of 200 witnesses and the mayor. I had waited 9 years for a room like that. I wasn't going to fill it with more words than it needed. The cascade, as these things go, was slow and complete. Not immediately, these things rarely are in real families. The day of the opening, after the ceremony, my family went to lunch at a restaurant near the museum. It was a slightly strange meal, the kind where everyone is being careful in a new way, choosing words differently than they usually do because the map has shifted and no one has fully reoriented yet. My father asked me careful questions about the acquisition process, about how permanent collections worked, about whether I had representation. I answered plainly. My mother was quieter than usual. Marcus kept looking at his phone and then putting it away, which I later found out was because he was looking at my name and finding things, gallery pages, a small profile in a regional arts magazine from 2 years ago, the museum's press release listing the acquired artists, and a brief biographical note on each. After lunch, my father walked me to my car and said, quietly, "I'm sorry we didn't pay more attention." I said I knew it wasn't intentional. He said, "It still should have been different." I said I knew that too. We hugged. He went back to the others. I drove home. The calls started the following week. My mother first. She called to ask whether I'd be willing to come to dinner the following Sunday and whether she could invite some people who she thought would be interested in my work. "Your Aunt Helen has a friend who collects ceramics," she said. I told her about the museum and she got very excited. Would that be all right? I said it would be fine. Then Diane, with the 40-minute call I mentioned. Diane processed things the way she processed everything, systematically, in order, beginning with acknowledgement and moving through understanding and arriving, at the end, at a plan. The plan, in this case, was that she wanted to come to my studio. She wanted to actually see what I did. She asked if she could bring her husband. I said yes. She came 2 weeks after the opening, on a Saturday morning. She spent 2 hours in the studio. She didn't say much. Mostly she walked the shelves the way my grandmother had walked them, slowly, stopping, looking. At one point she picked up a small cup, a test piece, not a finished work, something I'd been experimenting with in terms of texture, and held it in both hands. "You made this," she said. I did. "With your hands. And a wheel. And a kiln. But yes." She set it down carefully. "Okay," she said. It was a small word that contained something larger. I let it. The wider family ripple moved outward over the following month. The newspaper item had already circulated. My Aunt Helen had seen it. My mother's 2 closest friends had seen it. 2 former colleagues of my father's had mentioned it to him at the golf club. There was a particular phone call from my uncle on my father's side, a man who had spent 30 years in commercial real estate and who had, at various family gatherings over the years, made politely skeptical comments about the economics of art as a vocation, who called to say he'd read the article and wanted to know if I ever did commission pieces. I told him I did. He said he was renovating a conference room and had been thinking about a centerpiece piece for a low credenza. Something large, he said. Something that looked serious. I quoted him a price. He didn't haggle. It wasn't the point of any of this. The commission, the calls, the revised way the room now held me at family dinners. None of that was the point. Nana Ruth hadn't told me to keep going so that I could eventually be recognized by the people who doubted me. She told me to keep going because the work deserved it. Because something in the making itself, the clay, the heat, the years of iteration, was worth the full weight of my attention regardless of whether anyone else's attention followed. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't matter, a little, the way things that are true can matter, without being central. It mattered that my father apologized in the parking lot. It mattered that Diane stood in my studio holding a test cup in both hands and said, quietly, "You made this." It mattered that Marcus texted me the morning after the opening with nothing but a link to Dr. Aldridge's bio on the museum website and a single line. I looked her up. She's kind of a big deal. Just so you know. Just so you know. Yes. What I know now, 9 years into a vocation that my family filed under hobby for most of those 9 years, is that the people who love you are not always capable of seeing you clearly. That is not the same as them not loving you. My mother drove 40 minutes to my studio last winter and spent an afternoon watching me throw on the wheel, saying almost nothing, just watching. At the end, she said, "I didn't know it looked like that." "Like what?" I asked. "Like thinking," she said. "Like really thinking." That's what I know. The clay doesn't care whether the people in your life understand what you're doing. It responds to pressure and heat and time and the accumulated knowledge in your hands. The bowl with the translucent rim didn't become a museum piece because my family finally approved of it. It became a museum piece because I spent a year figuring out how to make clay do something it resists doing, and then I did it, and then I did it again until it was right. That's my story. A dark bowl, a translucent rim, and 14 collections that were there long before anyone in that ceremony room thought to check. If you've ever been told that what you love is just a hobby, if someone in your life has filed away the thing you work hardest at into the category of not serious, I want to know, was there a moment when they finally saw it? Or are you still waiting for that room? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.